In the long, golden days of a fading American summer, when the fields along the highway shimmered with heat and the roads stretched out like pale ribbons between small towns that all looked like they might once have been important and were now quietly, gently declining, 4 children walked. They walked with everything they owned, which was not very much: a small canvas bag that the oldest boy carried, a sweater rolled and tied around the middle girl's waist, a worn picture book tucked under the youngest girl's arm, and a small brown dog named Watch who had attached himself to them 3 towns back and shown no intention of leaving. Their names were Henry, Jesse, Violet, and Benny Alden, and they were alone in the world in the particular way that children become alone when the people who were supposed to take care of them are suddenly gone. Their parents had died the previous winter, first their mother in November, quietly and without much warning, and then their father in February, as though he had simply decided that a world without her was not a world he could stay in. They had been staying with their mother's sister, Aunt Clara, but Aunt Clara had a small house and a smaller income and a new husband who found 4 children an inconvenience he had not signed up for, and after 6 weeks the situation had become impossible in all the ways that impossible situations become, through accumulated sighs and cold silences and the kind of pointed remarks that adults make to each other within earshot of children, assuming children do not understand. Children always understand. They had heard, through Aunt Clara's evening conversations with her husband, that arrangements were being made. They were to be sent to their grandfather, their father's father, James Alden, a man none of them had ever met, who lived somewhere in Connecticut in a large house and was said to be wealthy, and about whom their father had never spoken without a careful, controlled expression that meant something had happened between them that had not been repaired. They had also heard, quite clearly, that Grandfather Alden was difficult and cold and that there was money enough, at least, which was the worst way possible to describe a person who was about to become the only family you had. Henry, who was 14 and who had been taking care of his siblings in every practical sense since February, heard all of this and made a decision. They would not go to a man described as difficult and cold who had never once tried to meet them in all their lives. They would manage on their own. Henry was old enough to work. Jesse was 12 and capable and steady. Violet was 10 and gentle and observant. Benny was 6 and small but fiercely willing, and Watch was, well, Watch was Watch, which was its own form of resource. They left at dawn with their small bag and their sweater and their picture book and their dog, and they walked north. The first 3 days were genuinely hard. They slept under a highway bridge the first night, huddled together for warmth with Watch pressed against Benny's back, and ate crackers from the bag and 2 apples that Jessie had thought to take from Aunt Clara's kitchen bowl, which she left 2 coins for because Jessie was the kind of person who left coins. The second night they slept in a hay barn whose farmer was asleep by 9 and did not hear them, and the hay was warm and sweet-smelling and Benny declared it the best bed he had ever had, which made Violet laugh and Henry feel, for the first time in days, something approaching okay. But they needed more than okay. They needed somewhere to actually live. It was Violet who found it. They had wandered into the edge of a patch of woodland behind a small town called Silver Creek, following a deer path through the trees mostly because it was shaded and cool and their feet hurt, when Violet stopped and pointed without speaking. Through the trees, partially screened by a stand of young birches and carpeted around with long grass and wildflowers, sat an old boxcar. It was a railway freight car, the kind that had once traveled between cities carrying goods, dark red and weathered silver, sitting on a short section of abandoned track that ended in the woods as though the railway had simply changed its mind halfway through a thought and walked away. Its door was slid half open. Its roof was intact. It was solid and dry and private. Henry walked around it twice. He knocked on the side the way a person knocks on a wall to check its soundness. He looked at the door mechanism and the floor, good, solid planks, no rot, and the small windows, high up, that would let in light. "It's a house," Benny said, with total conviction and no qualifications whatsoever. "It's a boxcar," Jessie said. "It's both," said Henry, and that was the decision made. What followed was, in the recollection of all 4 children for the rest of their lives, one of the most satisfying periods of their existence, not in spite of the difficulty but because of it. Because when you have very little, the distance between nothing and something is enormous, and every small gain feels like a victory, and every problem solved through ingenuity feels like a proof of something important about yourself. They began with the basics. Water first, always water first, Henry said, which was the kind of thing he had read in the adventure books he loved, and which turned out to be completely true. Jessie found a creek perhaps a quarter-mile through the trees, clear and cold, running fast over smooth stones. They could hear it if they stood at the boxcar door on quiet mornings, a distant, steady, cheerful sound that became as comforting to them as a heartbeat. Henry fashioned a carrying system using a length of rope and 2 old tin buckets he found half buried in the undergrowth near the track, remnants, perhaps, of some long-ago maintenance crew, and they established the first daily routine. Water collected in the morning before anything else. Food was harder. Henry walked to the nearest town, a 40-minute walk each way, and presented himself at the hardware store as available for work. He was tall for his age and serious-faced and spoke to Mr. Freeman, the proprietor, with the directness of someone who needed the job rather than wanted it and did not intend to pretend otherwise. Mr. Freeman, who was not an unkind man, gave him a trial week sweeping, stocking shelves, and making deliveries on the old bicycle chained outside. Henry worked with focused, quiet intensity that made Mr. Freeman, by the end of day 2, stop worrying about the trial week and simply assume the boy was staying. He paid Henry each Friday in cash and also, without comment, in a small bag of groceries: bread, milk, a block of cheese, sometimes a tin of soup or a paper bag of apples, which Henry accepted with a nod and a thank you that conveyed, without elaborating, that the groceries were understood and appreciated. Mr. Freeman did not ask questions, which Henry respected deeply. While Henry worked, Jessie managed the boxcar with the systematic thoroughness she brought to everything. She divided the interior into zones: sleeping area, eating area. A small section she designated as a pantry using a wooden crate stood on its end with the open face turned to the wall for shelving. She organized their limited possessions with such efficiency that everything had a place and every place was used, and the inside of the boxcar, which had been just a large wooden box, began to feel like somewhere specific and particular in theirs. She found, on a careful exploration of the woodland around them, a remarkable number of useful things. Abandoned but serviceable: 2 more wooden crates, a metal washbasin with a small hole that she patched with a piece of cork and a rubber band, a cast-iron pot with a lid, a coil of good wire, and a cracked enamel pitcher that still held water if you didn't fill it more than 3/4 full. She brought each find back to the boxcar with the satisfaction of someone assembling a puzzle whose final picture was not yet fully visible but was definitely beginning to make sense. "The woods are very generous," she told Violet one afternoon, as they sat sorting their collection, "if you pay attention." Violet paid attention to different things from Jessie but with equal intensity. Violet paid attention to the living world, the plants, the birds, the way the light changed through the trees at different hours, the particular way the creek sounded before and after rain, which told you the rain was coming or had been even when you couldn't see the sky. She was not a practical child in Jess's way. She could not patch a washbasin or calculate how far a block of cheese would stretch across a week, but she understood the woodland around their home in a way that turned out to be practically useful in ways nobody had anticipated. She identified, within the first 2 weeks, 4 varieties of wild berries that were safe to eat, a patch of watercress in the shallow edge of the creek that was excellent in any context, wild herbs that made the tin pot soup taste like something a kitchen had made rather than something a fire had suggested, and the habits and territories of every animal in their patch of woodland well enough that she could tell you, on any given morning, whether the deer had passed in the night and whether the fox that lived in the hollow elm 300 yards east had been hunting or resting. She also found the cherries. There was an old cherry tree, ancient, gnarled, magnificently productive, half a mile through the woods on the edge of what had once been a farm garden, now entirely gone to nature. Its fruit was dark red and sweet and abundant, and Violet found it on a Thursday afternoon in late July when she was following a particularly interesting butterfly, and came home with her dress pockets full and her face stained red and her eyes bright with the specific joy of unexpected abundance. They ate cherries for a week. Jessie pitted and dried a quantity of them on a flat stone in the sun for keeping. Henry brought a jar from the hardware store, and they packed the dried cherries in it with a strip of paper labeled Winter, which Benny thought was very serious and grown-up and which made all of them feel, for the first time, genuinely secure. Benny was the youngest and the smallest and the most energetic thing in the woodland, possibly in the entire county. He was also, it turned out, the most important member of the household in at least one specific way. He was extraordinarily good at finding things. Not lost things exactly, though he found those too, but things that existed in the general world and that nobody had thought to look for. He found a tin cup hanging on a nail at the very back of the boxcar, wedged into a crack in the wood and missed on every previous inspection. He found that the creek had a shallow, still pool around a bend that was warmer than the main flow and perfect for washing without freezing. He found a length of oilcloth under a pile of wet leaves that, when dried and cleaned, made a perfect tablecloth for the crate table where they ate. He found Watch's very favorite game, a stick thrown at a very specific angle that Watch would retrieve from impossible distances at full speed, which kept Watch exercised and happy and therefore a better-tempered household companion. And on one significant afternoon, 6 weeks into their life in the boxcar, Benny found the pink cup. It was in the creek, caught behind a smooth stone, bobbing very slowly in the current. A small china cup with pink roses on it, cracked on one side, the handle gone, but otherwise intact. Benny waded in without hesitation and retrieved it, held it up in the sun, and announced with absolute certainty that it was the most beautiful cup he had ever seen and that it was his. He drank all his milk from it thereafter. He washed it himself every evening. When Jessie asked why that particular cup, Benny considered the question with the seriousness it deserved and said, "Because I found it." It was the philosophy of their whole life in that woods, expressed by a 6-year-old with his trousers still wet from the creek. The found things were the treasures. Not because they were valuable but because the finding of them, the looking, the noticing, the carrying back, the making useful, was its own reward. Every crate and cup and coil of wire and jar of dried cherries was evidence of their own capability. And capability, it turned out, was the best possible antidote to fear. They were not without hard moments. There was a week in August when Henry came down with a fever and could not work, and Jessie made decisions alone with a calm surface and a quietly terrified interior, rationing their supplies and walking to town herself to tell Mr. Freeman that Henry was unwell and would return as soon as he was able. Mr. Freeman sent back a tin of chicken soup and a small bottle of medicine with no message attached, which was itself a message that Jessie received and was grateful for. There was a night of storms in September when the rain came in sheets and the lightning turned the woods bright white every few seconds, and Benny was frightened in a way that he was too proud to say directly but which manifested as pressing himself very hard against Violet's side and not speaking. Violet put her arm around him without making anything of it and told him the names of every animal she had identified in their woods, one by one, until the storm eased and his breathing slowed and he fell asleep mid-sentence about the fox in the hollow elm. There was the ongoing, quiet weight of not knowing what the future held, of being 4 children in a boxcar in the woods who were managing today and tomorrow and the week after but could not quite see beyond the autumn, and knew that autumn was coming. It was Henry who thought about this most, in the early mornings before the others woke, sitting at the boxcar door with Watch beside him and watching the light come through the trees. He thought about Grandfather Alden, whom they had been running from, and wondered sometimes whether running had been right. He knew it had been necessary, had been the only choice that felt honest at the time. But necessity and rightness were not always identical, and he was 14 and thoughtful enough to hold both ideas at once without forcing them to resolve. He thought about what their father had said once, or not said, but implied, in that careful expression he wore, and what might have happened between father and grandfather that had never been repaired, and whether things that had never been repaired were still broken or whether they were simply waiting. He didn't have an answer. He wrote it in the margin of his notebook, which was almost full now with accounts of their weeks in the woods, the practical things, the food and the water and the repairs, but also the other things. The cherry tree, Benny's pink cup, the names of the birds Violet had taught him, the sound of the creek before rain. Evidence of a life, accumulated carefully. He thought that someday, if he showed this to someone, they might understand what these months had been. Not suffering, though there had been hard days. Not adventure, though there had been extraordinary ones. Something more specific than either, the particular experience of discovering, in difficult circumstances, that you were more capable than you had known, and that capability shared between people who loved each other was the closest thing to safety that the world reliably offered. The autumn came, as it always does, without asking permission. The leaves turned and fell and the mornings became sharp. The creek ran colder. The cherries were long gone but the jar labeled winter sat on its crate shelf like a small promise kept. Henry's wages had accumulated carefully, kept in an envelope in the canvas bag. Enough now for something more than crackers and cheese, though they still spent with care because care was now a habit and habits, once formed well, do not break easily. It was on an October afternoon, with the trees bare and the sky very high and blue, that a man appeared at the edge of the woodland path and stood looking at the boxcar with an expression that was difficult to read, complicated and quiet, like a face that had been still for a long time and was only now beginning to move. He was old. He had white hair and steady eyes and good clothes and the bearing of someone who had been alone for a long time and had organized his life around the fact. He had Watch beside him, because Watch had gone to investigate and then stayed, sitting against the man's leg with an expression of full approval, which Watch reserved only for people worth approving. The 4 children stood in the boxcar doorway and looked at him. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "You look like your father." He was talking to Henry. Henry felt something shift in his chest, a lock turning that he had not known was there. The man's name was James Alden. He had been looking for them for 6 weeks. He had hired people to look, and checked every town, and eventually followed a thread of rumor and a kindly word from Mr. Freeman at the Silver Creek hardware store, who had said only that there were good children around who deserved finding. He stood at the edge of the boxcar and looked at what they had made: the swept wooden floor, the crate pantry with its organized shelves, the jar of dried cherries, the oilcloth tablecloth, Benny's pink cup sitting in its place, the water buckets with their rope-carrying system, the small neat sleeping area with their folded sweaters. And something moved across his face that Henry would spend years afterward trying to describe accurately and could only ever call recognition, as though he was seeing something he had believed in and been afraid was lost. "Your father," James Alden said carefully, "was the most resourceful person I have ever known. It was our stubbornness, both of us, that kept us apart. I have been sorry for it for many years." He paused. "I would like, very much, if you will allow it, to not be apart any longer." Benny stepped forward without hesitation, because Benny had never once in his life hesitated when something felt right, and held out his pink cup and said, "Do you want to see what I found?" James Alden looked at the small cracked cup with its painted roses and its missing handle, and he smiled, a slow, unguarded, genuine smile that was clearly not something his face did very often but that fit it, when it came, surprisingly well. "Yes," he said. "I would like that very much." They did not leave the boxcar that day, or even that week. James Alden came back the next afternoon, and the one after, and sat with them at the crate table and drank tea from the enamel pitcher and listened to Violet tell him about the fox and the hollow elm and the deer and the names of the trees. He was, they discovered, not difficult in the way that Aunt Clara's husband had described, or perhaps he had been, once, and had been working steadily on the problem. When they did finally come to his house, a large, warm, real house with proper beds and a kitchen and a garden, they brought the jar of dried cherries, and Benny's pink cup, and Henry's notebook, and the oilcloth tablecloth. And watch. They brought everything they had made and found and kept, because those things were who they had become, and who they had become was worth keeping. The boxcar stayed in the woods. James Alden had it cleaned and repaired and eventually turned into a kind of monument to what his grandchildren had done there, a place they could come back to, which they did, many times over many years, to remember what it felt like to know without any doubt that they were capable of managing, of making, of finding enough in difficult circumstances to not just survive but to build something worth belonging to. Resourcefulness, the children had learned, was not about having the right tools or enough money or ideal conditions. It was about looking at what you had, really looking, the way Violet looked at the woodland, the way Jessie looked at a wooden crate, the way Benny looked at a cracked china cup in a creek, and seeing not what was missing, but what was possible. And what was possible, it turned out, in even the most stripped down and difficult of circumstances, was quite a lot. Quite a lot indeed.